For today's video, we got a very interesting topic I want to discuss, and that is this idea or this glamorization behind the quote-unquote indie darling, and what it means when an indie game blows up, and how does that impact the rest of the market, or does it at all? The video game industry is like any other entertainment or consumer-based platform, and that is that it loves its winners, whether they are massive successes or the ever-popular underdog rise. That game that through adversity and challenges somehow makes it to the popular zeitgeist, and suddenly everyone can't stop talking about it. And when we look at the independent space, we've seen this idea, as I said before, of the quote-unquote indie darling, when that one game just somehow comes out of nowhere and everybody can't stop talking about it. And our example du jour this week is of Untitled Goose Game. And no, I didn't make that up, that is the name of it. And over the last 2 weeks, the game has gone meme-worthy, there are people ranting and raving about it, and it has occupied the same space as titles like Five Nights at Freddy's, Getting Over It with Ben Foddy, and everybody's favorite Goat Simulator. As a game that, for us regulars who look at the independent space, it just seems like another one of those games, but it has become to dominate the conversation. And we've seen this happen again time and time when it comes to the mainstream coverage of indie games. I've said this before, but I always get a chuckle when I play a game and then like 2 to 3 months later, you'll get a piece on IGN or Polygon or Kotaku with the reviewer or the journalist talking about this game like they've just unearthed some strange tomb, or they've discovered the identity or revealed the Loch Ness monster to the world. And we've seen this kind of like very much like a quick fascination with an independent game. And you'll get think pieces from people saying, this is what an indie game is, or this is what games should be about. And there have already been many pieces written about Untitled Goose Game, people describing it in terms of its accessibility or the fact that it's a non-violent game. And again, you'll have people who don't normally cover indie games just can't stop talking about it. And this again raises a very tricky conversation about what it means to be an indie developer and again survive in this market. As we've said many times over, for every indie game that blows up, there are hundreds more that just fail to make any appearance or any kind of buzz in the market. And it doesn't really become a factor of the quality of the game or the uniqueness of it. And this is where it becomes very difficult to discuss things in terms of why these games blow up. As we've said before, when you're trying to chart the success or how a game managed to succeed, it becomes almost like two different phases. The before it blows up and then the after. And many people only focus on the after. And when you do that, it doesn't really work from an analytical point of view. Because once that game has achieved that success, any discussions about marketing or tips or things you can glean from it go away. And we'll be talking more about that, obviously, in our second part with the game I'm sure most of you have already guessed we're going to see footage of. But with something like Untitled Goose Game, from watching footage of the game and seeing a few reviews of it, it looks a lot like the other indie games we've played. An idea that sounds great in concept that was kind of put together to be its own small game. Again, something like Getting Over It in the corner is a good example. This was a game that YouTubers, streamers, and major sites couldn't stop talking about it. But when we played it, it was a game. That's it. Was it a good game? We could certainly argue probably not, as you've seen me flailing and failing in that part for the last minute or so. But that didn't stop people from talking about it. And that again is a major point about this idea of the indie darling. That these games that tend to blow up don't necessarily qualify as being amazing games. Now obviously something like Celeste definitely got mainstream popularity thanks to its assist mode, the challenging gameplay, and again the story focus on depression. But for a lot of the other darlings that managed to rise up, we can find noticeable issues or problems with their design. Five Nights at Freddy's being a really good example. That game has some major issues from a design standpoint. That didn't stop it from having its own book series, dolls, clothing. There's a movie coming out. I'm sure they've already figured out ways to license it for TV, and who knows what else is coming. But this is where it gets very nasty or very annoying to talk about. That, as I said, for every one of these games that blows up, I can think of dozens of other games that certainly have deserved even a tenth of the level of praise that these games have gotten, and would have done so much to help them. And again, this is where it becomes very hard to talk about when it comes to being an independent developer. And the fact that you see these games blow up, and then everybody tries to copy it. I am very sure, as we are sitting here and you're watching this video right now, somebody's thinking of Untitled Duck Game, Untitled Battle Royale, Duck visual novel game, Beyond That Hatful of Boyfriend. And if anyone has come up with those games, I hereby do request a licensing fee for me giving you that idea. And again, when people try to chase the darlings of the industry, they tend to end up failing because they don't quite understand how those games manage to succeed. And in cases like with Untitled Goose Game, Getting Over It, Five Nights at Freddy's, they're really ideas that you can only really do one game out of it, and there's just not much else there to cover. Now, before we move on to our second game example, there's one last thing that I want to talk about. And again, that's with these ideas of these niche ideas blowing up. For games like Untitled Goose Game, Getting Over, and so on, that when people cover them in the mainstream market, they always are kind of given this reverence in terms of their appeal. And like I said earlier, it's an idea that this is what all games should be, or this is what an indie game is. And I always hate that kind of distinction, because people are talking about Untitled Goose Game again, saying that this is the perfect example of an accessible game, or we shouldn't have hard games, we should just have Untitled Goose Game. And again, putting these games on these pedestals like this discounts the work and the creativity that we see from other independent games. And again, a lot of these titles that try to become critically well received oftentimes can end up being commercial failures. A big example would be Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. That critics couldn't stop talking about this game, but again, while they may have never saw a game like that, that still doesn't qualify it to be a great or innovative game. And as we've talked about before, there are definitely elements that are standard in terms of great designs. And it doesn't matter how much money you put into marketing, or if you're trying to tell a solemn or depressing story, if the gameplay doesn't work. And again, with something like not Five Nights at Freddy's, Getting Over, although there may be a crossover at some point, who knows, there are definitely design issues with it. Now, whether or not those were left in intentionally or just as a mistake, that we don't have a way to talk about unless we get Ben Foddy on for a cast. But whenever we have mainstream coverage of these games, that they tend to ignore the other titles out there. And other times, mainstream coverage tends to ignore or downplay issues with the game to focus on the artistic side of things. And again, for them for a lot of the mainstream coverage who they only think that, games exist in the form of Nintendo, Battle Royale, or Call of Duty, yes, that is amazing. But for people who cover or play indie games on a regular basis, we're a lot more discerning when it comes to measuring out the quality of these games. So with that said, we're going to do our quick Patreon supporter and sponsor shout out. And when we return, again, we're going to talk about what it means for an indie game to blow up and the important lessons you need to take care of and what are often ignored when it comes to their success. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom sponsors and Patreon supporters. And we'd like to continue the discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. Yes, we are once again returning to the Darkest Dungeon as our example. And Darkest Dungeon here definitely became the quintessential example of not only a successful game that was crowdfunded, but how much of an impact it had in terms of Kickstarter to early access to now basically setting the studio up for success. And it certainly became an indie darling. And as we've seen over the last few months and year, we have seen other games try and copy its style. As I said earlier, when we look at games that succeed, there's always that before and after. Before it became a major success and people covered, and then the aftershock of that. And many people in the mainstream industry or mainstream market, consumers and developers, only tend to focus on the after. They see a game like Darkest Dungeon succeed, and they'll only look at things from a superficial point of view. The Darkest Dungeon succeeded because it was a Lovecraftian game. No. It succeeded because it was a side-scrolling dungeon crawler. No. It succeeded because it had Wayne June in it. Well, kind of on that one. I'll give them that point. But when you look at games that succeeded and became kind of like the new hot trend, it's important to understand that so much of what goes into a successful game you can't really see at the time of its success. As we've said, with Darkest Dungeon and Red Hook Games, Chris and Tyler were marketing and refining their idea months before they even had a Kickstarter idea. They were doing marketing campaign while they were still at the prototype and early concept stage of their game. And when the game succeeded, it didn't succeed because it was a brutally difficult game with Wayne June in it. Those were the elements that helped it. But so much of the success of that game came down to the work that went on behind the scenes in terms of playtesting, iterating on the idea, making sure the Kickstarter was right, and so on and so forth. So that when we see games that try to copy Darkest Dungeon, as we saw with games trying to copy Getting Over It and Five Nights at Freddy's and Goat Simulator and so on and so forth, that these games just copy the superficial area or the superficial concepts, and then these people or these developers are shocked that it doesn't get the same coverage. Because when you have games that succeed like this, and I'm going to be very cynical with this point, when they succeed, they become essentially an oasis onto themselves in the desert of the game industry, and somebody needs to come up with some art to describe that. When you have these oases succeed, anyone else who tries to copy those games tend to end up lost in the shuffle. FTL being another quintessential example of this. FTL was a 1000% indie darling when it rose to popularity this decade. And so many developers thought to themselves, I could make the next FTL, or I could make FTL but with this. And when they tried to copy FTL's formula, usually they ended up being less than that game, even though they came out after, and essentially they had the entire guidebook of FTL right there in front of them because that game succeeded. The point, though, is that while FTL succeeded because of its difficulty and its design, so many other factors go unnoticed in terms of its success. Just having a spaceship and you're able to view the insides of it and shoot other enemies doesn't make your game succeed as FTL did. And even with that said, FTL's difficulty still turned away some people, just as it did with Darkest Dungeon. And with something like Untitled Goose Game, I'm sure there are people who aren't going to give that game the time of day for any number of reasons. The one that I'm kind of hearing from my people is that it is, of course, an Epic Games exclusive right now. But when you're trying to copy or be the next big name game, you have to understand everything. Why it worked, what elements didn't work, and then you have to use that when you're trying to apply it to your own game. Just copying Darkest Dungeon or Five Nights at Freddy's is not enough of a pull. You may get some people who are just looking for their next big fix, but you are still competing with that main game. And getting back to the analogy of the oasis in the desert, when these games blow up like this, it's important to keep, I think, an even head. Because like I said, when the mainstream coverage gets a hold of indie games and they're so shocked and astonished at what comes out of it, that they're just going to go back to mainstream coverage the next week. And you cannot just chase after somebody else's game. And this is what a lot of indie developers kind of talk about when they see these games become quote-unquote overnight successes. That nobody's going to talk about my game, all they care about is Darkest Dungeon or Untitled Goose Game and so on. And unfortunately, this is one of those things that I don't know there's a fix for other than just completely remaking what game journalism is. Because as for those of you watching me, you know I tend to play a few indie games here on the channel and talk about them. And while I try to give a voice to them, it becomes a monumentous task to try and convince somebody to play your game. And again, this is why this idea of the darlings come into play. Because if you know Darkest Dungeon succeeded or Untitled Goose Game succeeded, you can mention that in your marketing PR. My game is like Untitled Goose Game, but we're using ducks, or mice, or cats, dogs, you name it. And when you try and do it like that, you're still kind of hurting your game, because why should I play your version of this popular game when I still have it? And one thing that I am going to be very curious to see, and this will be our final point for this video, is what is going to happen following the release of Boyfriend Dungeon. This is the roguelike dating sim game from Kit Fox Games, and they have done an amazing job of marketing the game and getting it out there. And I suspect that this will probably be either the next indie darling or one coming down the line when it's released. And I want to see what the mainstream coverage of this game is going to be, and how many YouTubers and streamers are going to jump on that bandwagon. And speaking about marketing, apparently one of those damn YouTube apps popped up as I was talking too, which is kind of, I guess, apropos for this piece. And again, you see this kind of corporateness when it comes to these games. As we saw with the I Love You Colonel Sanders game, that the only reason I played that was a child threw his, I guess, drug cartel money at me to play it. And there's a Wendy's RPG game that I think is either out or coming out as well. So, again, it's we're ending this video very cynically, I guess, in terms of people trying to copy the next big thing without understanding why it succeeded. So, here's my final question for this piece. As we've said, when these games become darlings, everybody tries to copy them, and most often, they end up being less than the game they try to emulate. So, can you think of examples of games that explicitly copied a popular indie game or AAA game, and they managed to succeed, either by being better than the original source or going in such a different direction that they managed to just rise above it all by being unique. Let me know in the comments below, but thank you for watching this video. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel linked down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.